Hi everybody, welcome to Designing for Somebody. Thank you for getting up this early to come to this Saturday morning session, and thank you to the MidCamp Planning Committee for putting on this event. My name is Kylie, or Kylie Wojciechowski, and I'm not a typical MidCamp attendee, let alone a typical MidCamp presenter. Before I tell you why, let me remind you of our keynotes. First principle for inclusion yesterday: don't ever judge anybody speaking at a Drupal conference. I have never worked with Drupal before, full disclosure, and I never really knew much about Drupal before attending some sessions on it yesterday. So why the hell am I here? I am a graduate student at the University of Michigan School of Information, currently in an Agile Project Management Methodologies course taught by Michael Hess, who's on the Drupal security team. And towards the beginning of the semester, he encouraged our class to submit proposals to MidCamp based on whatever sort of value we thought we could provide to conference attendees. So I figured, I'll try. And a few weeks, maybe months later, I'm here. And I'm here to talk to you guys about something that's a little different than I think is par for the course for this conference, but something that I hope will nonetheless be valuable to you. And that is a high-level overview of the processes of contextual design and contextual inquiry. So some groundwork for the next however long I talk for. This session will cover why you shouldn't design, develop, or implement a system for just anybody or for everybody. It will cover why you shouldn't design, develop, or implement a system without knowing the systems or your users. And it will cover how you can come to truly know your users through contextual design and inquiry. I'll be drawing from some of my own experiences in the classroom and in my internships with contextual inquiry, just to provide some sort of example that I can point to. This session won't cover anything related to code, anything really technical, and anything explicitly related to Drupal. So if that's not your speed, I won't be offended if you walk out now, but just so you know what you're getting into, that's what we'll be talking about today. So, designing for somebody, not just anybody and not everybody. What does that mean? So, designs that claim to meet the needs of anybody and designs that claim to meet the needs of everybody are somewhat similar. A design for anybody would be a design that any random person off the street would be able to use. This type of design would necessarily be as non-technical, non-complicated, non-industry specific, and non-complex as possible, so as to guarantee that literally anybody would find it intuitive to use if such a thing exists. This design would necessarily be very generic, appealing to the lowest common denominator of any potential user's background, skills, and experiences. Similarly, a design for everybody is a design that every single person in this room, at this conference, in Chicago, throughout the country, would be able to find a use for. This type of design would necessarily be very bloated with any and all features that everybody could ever want to use related to a particular system or service. Accordingly, neither of these user group examples should ever be used for a design, development, or implementation process. Using these as user groups for which to design or develop for can only lead to, like I said, very generic or very bloated outcomes, which no user will really find meets their specific needs. So if we're trying to not design or develop or implement for just anybody or for everybody, we want to develop for somebody. We want to create useful stuff, obviously. So we want to develop or design or architect or build a specific solution that meets a specific need of a specific group of users. We want to design things for that somebody and what that somebody does. So how do we go about doing that? This is where contextual design comes in. Contextual design is one way to design for somebody, and it's the way that I'll talk about this morning. This is a user-centered design process developed by Karen Holzblatt and Hugh Beyer, and it incorporates ethnographic methods for collecting data that's relevant to a system or product or service being developed or revised or improved. Martin and Hannington have defined contextual design as a customer-centered design process in which every step is anchored in customer data, making it feel less like design magic. So this is a very data-driven design methodology. And so these are, the process of contextual design has, at least on paper, a lot of these steps. There's many methods of data collection, intermediary steps of data synthesis and analysis, and then some research deliverables that hopefully result in a usable, useful design product. This is just a brief overview of these steps laid out by Holtzblatt and Beyer, but we really will be only focusing on the first one within the scope of this session, somewhat touching on the two that follow it, because I think these are the most valuable at the beginning stages of a design or implementation process. So, as I had mentioned, contextual inquiries will be the focus of this presentation as it pertains to the scope of contextual design. So before we get into this first step of contextual design, which is contextual inquiry, I want everybody to think about what they do every day when you come into work. Just in your heads, you don't have to talk or tell me or anything like that. So accordingly with that, one of Holtzblatt's and Beyer's principles underlying the contextual design process is that which states people are experts at what they do, but unable to articulate their own work practices. So essentially what this boils down to is this. We know what we do, but not exactly how we do it. When you thought about what you did every day, it was at a fairly mid-level range. You didn't consider your individual keystrokes that you do to perform your job, nor is it likely that you considered how your work fits into the larger organization's functional workflow. That is, our work processes and how we perform them are really tacit, especially when we're asked to consider or recount them when we're not in our typical work environment or mindset, just like I asked you to do. So this begs the question of how users, developers, or researchers are supposed to actually learn how their users do what they do, and that's through contextual inquiry. According to Martin and Henningsen again, contextual inquiry is an immersive method of observing and interviewing that reveals underlying and somewhat invisible work structures. According to me, contextual inquiry is really observing somebody doing their job in their actual workspace and asking them questions about what they're doing. This is field work at its core, for my field at least. If you're able to watch somebody do their work, you'll be able to understand and observe, even if you have to ask follow-up questions, the tacit parts involved in their task performance beyond what they'd be able to articulate to you in a decontextualized setting, as in a sterile interview or something similar. So this is something I've done in a couple different instances in my coursework at the University of Michigan. It's something I've done with a local public library in a consulting methodology class I took last semester, and it's something I'm currently doing on a larger scale to support a CRM implementation project with U of M's Office of Enrollment Management. In those cases, when an organization has identified a problem with their workflow, or when an organization is introducing or wants to introduce a new tool or system, contextual inquiries can be helpful in exploring how work is actually being done in an organization, and recommendations and requirements can follow from the data resulting from the exploration. So these are the key parts of a contextual inquiry process. First, we have context. Obviously, we have to understand users and their needs in the actual context in which they do work. This is done by observing them do actual work in their actual workspaces. Not in a conference room, not at a conference, just in where they work. We want to understand how they do it in that particular context. Another key part is partnership, and we have to work with users in this method as partners throughout the inquiry process. A good piece of advice I've heard from my professors is that you as a contextual inquirer should situate yourself as an apprentice to the user's expert in this situation, ready and waiting for the user, for the expert, to guide us through their actual work activities. Another key part is interpretation, and you similarly related to the partnership aspect of contextual inquiry, we have to work with users to come to a mutual interpretation, a common understanding of the work we're doing, because our insights are only so valuable in that they're accurately assessing what the user is actually doing. And then the last key part is a focus. Contextual inquiries in most cases should not require like a predefined set of questions that you go through and ask the user. It shouldn't be a standard interview. You should come to a contextual inquiry session with a clear project focus. That is, a clear idea of what you want to explore, the work processes you want to get more involved with, and maybe a protocol that lists the points that you want to be sure you cover in your observation session. But that's all. You shouldn't use a script, but like a protocol really to guide you through the process. And so this protocol is really, I guess, a map. You could consider it for a successful contextual inquiry. And you can write this protocol out as a guide for the first few times you conduct a contextual inquiry, but it really will become second nature after a while. The first key part of this protocol is really the introduction, and this is important for setting the stage for what's to come in your contextual inquiry, because your users aren't really, your experts in this case, aren't really going to understand what it is that you're doing, why you're observing them do their work. So setting the stage for exactly what you're doing and the purposes that serves is important in this. And similarly, you should introduce yourself and the scope of your work so that they know what they should be working on when you're with them. You should set expectations for the length of the interview/observation session, which is usually about an hour, I found. After anything longer than that, people start to lose focus. And then you should be sure here to set up the user as the expert. In that case, that situating yourself as just there to learn from them. And then during the observation/interview, the contextual inquiry, you should, as I've said, observe the user's tasks and ask questions according to your research focus. And you can be nosy. You can say, hey, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? You're there to learn. Accordingly, you should take notes and audio record the conversation with their consent. And you should collect any artifacts, documents they reference, things like that. At a minimum, you should set out to learn the specific things they do to complete specific work processes, their pain points with how things are now, and their goals for their own work processes. And here it's super important to ask the user to talk about their actual work and provide specific examples of their processes, reconstructing situations when possible. If they begin to talk abstractly or summarize, that information is not really useful to contextual inquiry because it's decontextualized. It's based on their memory, and the accuracy is really reliant on their memory, which is, as we discussed, not infallible. So we don't want to rely on what they think they do, but we want to rely on what we're actually seeing them do. And this is hard to do. This is hard to not ask them to predict what they would do given X, what they would do with better tools, what they would do with better systems. And so this is one of the hardest parts I found of contextual inquiry, is making it a concrete conversation about what they're actually doing and not straying into summary or abstraction or predictions, I guess, on their end. And then after this main bulk of your interview observation, you should kind of start the wrap-up, in which you, with the user, create a shared larger interpretation of what you've observed and what you've learned so that you're on the same page about what just happened. Next step after contextual inquiry, ideally you would complete a series of contextual inquiries because nobody works in isolation, but you would conduct this set of interviews and observations with people performing similar jobs or people working on a team. And after you have a series of these done, you would conduct interpretation sessions after each contextual inquiry with your team to go over your notes and any observations to essentially interpret your data, capturing any key findings. This interpretation session, what you could call it when you do this, you should start by creating a user profile, which includes like demographic information about the user's job and the roles they fill. And then in this case, you should assign them a code that you'll use to refer to them throughout the inquiry process. In this case, then, the person who conducted the contextual inquiry should then walk the team through their interview without summarizing, just by going through their data points. And a designated note taker should be taking notes on the walkthrough with other team members asking questions throughout the walkthrough. Any key issue, interpretation, characteristic breakdown, or insightful quote on the end of the user should be recorded as a standalone affinity note, attributed to the code of the respected user profile. And an affinity note is just that, a note about a data point in a contextual inquiry, essentially. And a general rule of thumb that I found is that you should have between probably 50 and 100 affinity notes for every hour of contextual inquiry conducted. So with your contextual inquiries done and interpreted, then the next step usually is affinity diagramming. And this affinity diagram will bring together issues and insights across all customers into like a wall-sized hierarchical diagram to reveal the scope of the problem or the scope of the user tasks that you are observing. So to do this, after you, like I said, after you have all your, however many hundreds of affinity notes, after a handful of the inquiries, it's suggested, like I said, to write each on either like a small sticky note or use an online tool like Mural.co. And then with your massive collection of affinity notes, it's time to create an affinity diagram. And if I can show you, I guess, what that looks like real quick, maybe. So this is an example of an affinity wall that I had created for a different research process, but essentially what I had done was I conducted a series of contextual inquiries with users, and with my team, we recorded each individual data point on the yellow sticky notes. And then we grouped them under blue sticky notes, which summed up any key themes or interpretations that we found. And then we just kept going higher until the green sticky notes, where we found kind of the key problems or findings of our research process. And that was just based on shared interpretation of what the data meant and what the data highlighted. So that seems, like I had said, to go back to this recommended steps for contextual design. So we focused mostly on the contextual inquiry, where we talk to users and we observe what they do. And we talked briefly about the interpretation sessions. Those are pretty open-ended in terms of the structure of them, but essentially, like I had said, it's just a walkthrough of what your data found. And then we talked briefly about the affinity diagrams, wherein you bring your data points together on this. It's been large actual physical diagram, but based on my experiences, I think it's probably going to be more common for that to be more digital, using online tools to do that, because it is a pain to get all the sticky notes together and go through that process. But so that is the process that I have mostly been following in my own work. I haven't really been in a position where I can do the visioning, storyboarding, user environment design, and paper mockups, but depending on your role in an organization and what you're really looking to get out of your research process, those steps can follow from there as well. With your affinity diagram, what's revealed, as I had said, was a critical set of findings related to how your users currently perform their day-to-day tasks, their pain points with the current processes, and their goals for their processes. In some cases, like I had mentioned, this may be enough, or given your role, this may be enough, but you could, in other cases, this may not be sufficient, so you could go ahead to learn more information about your users using that process laid out that I had mentioned by Holtzblatt and Beyer. These two readings are things that I would definitely suggest in there. Non-coincidentally, we were excited for this presentation. As I had mentioned, Holtzblatt and Beyer kind of pioneered this method of contextual design with all the steps underneath it, and this Martin and Hannington text is a good primer for brief introductions into various methods of design research. Okay, a little short, but any questions? Yeah.
Could you give us some examples of how you realize this research through, choices made in a wireframe or design or particular features? Like, how does this translate into the website?
Okay, yeah. So to go to my my internship right now, so I'm supporting a CRM implementation project with the Office of Enrollment Management at University of Michigan. So what I am doing is I'm sitting down with users in like financial aid, in admissions, and I'm sitting with them and watching them do their job. And from what I am learning, I'm making these affinity notes and I'm looking at their discrete work processes. And from there, I'm making recommendations to the technical implementation team about what features we need in this CRM tool so that we don't disrupt the user's workflows when we switch to this new tool in a year or so, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So that's just one specific example. In another instance where we had really, in a class I had taken, a public library came to the class that I was in and said, we're having problems collecting feedback from patrons. So we looked at how they were currently collecting data from their patrons, and then from our affinity diagram made recommendations about how they can better do that work process. Yeah.
So, first things, and this sounds like it's focused on kind of with the websites that I work on, typically it would be like the content creators or the content editors, the business side. Have you seen, maybe is that accurate, or is there an opportunity for looking at customer behavior or like an end user perspective doing the same tools, and maybe how you kind of get those customers involved in the same kind of exploratory process?
Yeah, I think it's similarly to like usability test recruiting, where you would want end users to look at where you'd want to see how end users use a tool. I think that this process would be definitely appropriate for looking at how end users use a system, and then making changes based on your observations of how they use it. But it just might take a little more recruiting, similar to how you would recruit for standard usability testing, if that makes sense. Yeah.
You mentioned collecting data for the library.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have some kind of concrete examples of how were they doing before? What you learned and how you changed it?
Right. So it was a small public library in Flint, Michigan, actually. And what we did was we sat in on any like a family or like kids events or adult events that they conducted for the community. And we took notes. We just observed what the librarians or the program facilitators did, specifically paying attention to how they distributed feedback requests at the end of a program. And from then we found patterns between how specific librarians got feedback and what they did with that feedback afterwards to share it with the larger staff. And from there we saw a lot of work process breakdowns wherein some librarians were uploading this information to a shared server space. Others were just throwing the feedback forms on their desks and forgetting about them for weeks on end, So with our observations of what we saw and our kind of holistic interpretation of the data points, we were able to make recommendations for like a shared space where they have to upload their user feed or their participant feedback after they host a program, so that it can be used to further drive data-driven decisions about what programs to bring back, which programs to focus on, and things like that. Yeah.
In your current project, are you going to use analytics to see how the system's working now for the site, and then compare that to your Affinity?
Well, what's interesting about that is that this CRM that's being used in the Office of Enrollment Management, they don't have one right now.
Okay.
So all data is just thrown wherever in each of these individual offices, and the CRM is hoping to bring all the data together into one spot. And so we want to just make sure that we're not breaking anything when we introduce this new system. So I'm kind of just looking at their current processes now and how we can sort of support those in the future. So we're just looking at, I guess, the current state rather than the current state of how they work rather than how they work with a specific tool or system now.
Follow up.
Yeah.
What's like a profound observation you've found so far?
Well, so full disclosure, I have always been just amazed by, the University of Michigan. It's this huge school, this really prestigious, beyond my wildest dreams that I'd be studying there. So I figured their admissions process, I figured everything would be pretty clean on the back end, not really stuck together with duct tape or anything like that. Many of the admissions processes for specific schools are just copying and pasting application data into Excel spreadsheets. Shared, and I'm like, what? Like that? The curtain has dropped, I guess, on anything that I thought. So personally, it's just been weird to see that, like, how piecemeal the system has been. But in terms of how that relates to the CRM, essentially, it's just more fodder for the rationale for needing a system like that, because there's so much error that could be introduced in such a manual process. So that's kind of what my data is suggesting now, that whatever's going on now is just not foolproof enough. Yeah.
In the case of the librarian that just threw all the reviews on her desk to upload later, like I imagine she's not supposed to, or they're not supposed to do that. How do you get them to show you that? I mean, I feel like if you were interviewing them, they'd like want to do it correctly, like how they're supposed to,
Right.
and not really show you that they're kind of being lazy.
Right.
So
right.
how do you encourage that?
Yeah, that's definitely an issue. People want to clean up their desk before you come, and they want to, a lot of honestly, with the library example, a big pushback we had was them wanting to meet like in a conference room where we could, not be crowded with all their books and all their papers everywhere. But it's really important for this method to make sure that it's in context. And, the first few times I've done this, I probably wasn't successful in allowing them to show me their actual work process, But I tend to be pretty adamant that I want to see exactly what they do, And so with the library example in particular, like sometimes we would tell them we were coming, but we weren't telling them exactly like, oh, we're going to be just observing this session, but we also want to come see how you do this data process. So it was a thing where we, not that we didn't set expectations, but that we didn't tell them exactly what our process, what would be observing, I guess you could say, just so that we wanted to make sure they were being as authentic as we could observe in their process.
Are you finding it hard to, when you define the audience for a specific person, having outside people say, we need to include these people and these people and these people as part of the process?
Yeah, and it's particularly with the library example, the director of the library was our main contact, and she just wanted us to talk to other, executives, not executives, but like managers at the library. It was really hard actually to get to talk to the actual librarians because they were so busy with everything else. And what's a good kind of a benefit of this, if you can spin it the right way, is that it shouldn't take up much time of the participant because they are still technically working. You might just have to take some time out for questions during your contextual inquiry process, but it is a bit challenging to squeeze in on people's schedules. So it's any time you can build in to compensate for that is definitely a good thing in that case. Yeah.
Did you do any reporting of your findings on the employee processes, and then the managers see that and say, well, no, that's not how things are done here at all?
Right. That definitely is a concern, I think, with this process, especially with the librarians, because they didn't want their bosses to know that they weren't doing things according to protocol, which is why those user profiles and user codes are really important, because we sort of anonymize the data with that. But there has been cases where, in my CRM project in particular, where two people who are supposed to be like the admissions directors for a particular school, for example, are kind of in disagreement about what the actual work process is. But it's the goal of this contextual inquiry session to come to kind of a shared interpretation of what is actually going on. Even if there is some conflict, that just highlights the need that the CRM tool needs to implement, a more streamlined work process for them to follow. Yeah.
So you kind of talked a little bit about evaluating it, or this within the context of like a larger initiative, but I was kind of curious if you've seen if you do this once, or if you repeat this over and iterate over it, and like once you get the results, you kind of refine it over time and see if those things have changed. But like, if somebody's thinking about doing this, is there recommendations like, okay, if you can't do this twice, you're going to get, like, you can't iterate it over multiple times, maybe you're going to get limited success, but, you know, it's kind of like, what is the range of applications for having this be part of the process?
Let me think about
Maybe
that.
too big of a question.
Yeah, in terms of my, I can kind of guess at an answer, but in terms of my experience with it, I've only been included on the kind of in the front of the process. You know, I haven't been there for any revision or any kind of iteration on the process. But I imagine that, for example, with the CRM system, after it's implemented in a year or so, I can definitely see like an application where we'd kind of do this process again to see if it's any better. But I would kind of venture to guess that it would be more about collecting user pain points to specifically make fixes in the system rather than kind of map out a large-scale plan for a revision, but more so how the implementation team can meet their specific needs in the near future, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of a different purpose with it after each iteration. Yeah.
So with this process kind of defined, and you're building a new system to educate the users, then are you going to probably take this and work with like content people to kind of, after you have the system defined?
Right. Yeah. So beyond that is, as it stands, beyond the scope of what I will be involved with as an intern. But from what I'm understanding, there's going to be a lot of training sessions for users and a lot of content like help, documentation developed for use. But in terms of what I will be involved with, I can't really explicitly speak to anything because
Seems like it's really useful to develop that kind of content. So.
Right. Yeah, that'll definitely be on the works. I'm just not really privy to the end of the conversation yet. Yeah.
When you're constructing the affinity diagrams, how do you decide how many levels of hierarchy you group things under? I think you have 3 levels above. Is there any sort of optimum?
Honestly, that was what our professor told us to do in terms of that one in particular. But I think a general rule of thumb was to have, I want to say, between like 3 and 7 discrete data points under each larger heading before building onto the next one, just so that it's a manageable range. Anything smaller can probably be grouped into something else, and anything bigger can probably be broken up a little bit. So I would say that 3 to 7 range is probably the sweet spot for that. But I don't know what that's based on. That's kind of just what I've been taught.
Can you explain this affinity wall thing in a little bit more detail? What is this with all the post-it notes?
Yeah, so...
Show the picture.
Okay. Well, I can show you a video of it, actually. I think we have a video somewhere.
Enhance.
Yeah.
It's like a 3-hour video.
24 seconds, sped up. But yeah, probably about 5-hour process. This is just my work team from last semester. But so we had all the sticky notes on the table, and here we're just kind of constructing the groupings at this point. Kind of common themes we found. So like I had said, during our interpretation sessions, we, any discrete data point, any particularly strong quote, anything that could stand alone as a data point, I guess. Any particular breakdown in the workflow, we recorded it as an affinity note on a little sticky note. And we had probably close to 500 at that point. This is a pretty relatively, I would say, large scale. This is pretty, I realize this is pretty, a pretty big time commitment on a typical development process. So this is maybe not realistic in a lot of cases, but we had those 500 sticky notes, and we kind of just started grouping, and we started merging groups, taking groups apart until my team and I came to a common understanding of what these main groupings should be, and then we just kept building upwards with the groupings, and then that's kind of it. I don't know. Did that answer your question, Professor? Okay.
Yeah, no, that's
Okay.
exactly what I'm looking for.
Okay, yeah.
What soft skills do you employ when you're having these conversations with your clients? Because what I find is often, clients will hire a team to fix a problem, but in order to fix the problem, you have to talk to them about pain points and weaknesses, and those can be difficult conversations. So how do you address that?
I think one of the things that I have found is crucial to that is situating the user as the expert, situating yourself as there just to learn from them, by putting your confidence in them and situating them as the expert in the situation, and you're simply just there to learn from them. I think that really, for me at least, it has helped kind of break down any barrier that might arise. But I think also, it depends on how you talk to them, how you come into the session. If you come in really straight-laced and almost intimidating in a way, like you're hoping to, we want to be sure that we're not it doesn't come across as we're auditing them. We want to avoid kind of the evaluation tone of voice, the evaluation questions, the evaluative questions, but we want to just learn in that case. So I think situating it as a learning session, an observation session, will sort of work to break down the barriers. But then also any standard good interviewing techniques come into play with body language, what certain words you choose and things like that. So definitely interpersonal skills are really important in this particular research method.
Your recording stopped.
Oh.
Yeah.
Because of your monitor, maybe?
Oh, whoops. Thank you. Ooh.
Unless it's full.
It doesn't have signal, it's flashing blue.
That's what that means.
Okay. Thank you.
I was going to say, add to that, because I know some things that I do that helps me out is using open-ended questions, because people love talking about themselves.
Right.
So the more you kind of, get them talking, talking about themselves, their processes of it,
Right.
You just ask a very simple open-ended question, and then now they're just, they're just going on and on and on.
Right. Yeah.
I'm just wondering what are some of the things that you've said or done to convince their managers that this is valuable? Because they might be against that, kind of like what you pointed out, against them talking to, the folks that work underneath them, and they don't want to take away for time reasons, but I think it's more than that. It could be political, whatever. And so how do you convince the manager that this will be valuable?
Right. So with my current scope, I'm just kind of along for the ride on the implementation team in particular, and I haven't had to deal with that necessarily. But I think persuading the it really deals down to making the argument that this is useful for your end product. This is useful for productivity. This is useful for streamlined work processes, things like that. And what I found is that being really flexible on availability has been important. With this project I'm currently working on, I started scheduling interviews in January, and I'm scheduling out to April at this point. I'm trying to be really flexible with people, with when people are available, and taking any time I can get. As I had mentioned, a typical a standard session would be an hour. If I can get 15 minutes, I'll take 15 minutes, But I've just had to, I found, be patient on my end, but I think there is a lot of negotiation and buy-in that has to happen at a higher level beyond that, which I can really intelligently speak to right now.
You think an hour is enough? Because like in our working environment, we'd be like, let's shadow someone for half a day, or let's shadow someone for a full day.
Right. So, yeah, an hour would probably be, like I said, I've done like up to 2 hours, and I found after the first hour, focus is lost. People are trying to multitask. Ideally, it's good to be able to observe like one discrete task that would take an hour or so. But if it comes down to where you need to observe this multi-hour long process, I think that's appropriate. But we just want to be sure that we're being, genuine to the project focus, I guess, if that makes sense.
So this process reminds me of a project I was on. It was after the housing bubble, and the client was a law firm that was helping people apply for the HEMP program, which was a Obama's program that kind of bail out people who were underwater. And it kind of mapped out as people had to show, you had to show your income, you had to show, any assets you had had to tell the story of what happened. And so it was kind of set up as 6 screens. There's a discrete screen for your income, there's a discrete screen for your assets, and it looked like a really great process. So we all went out to see one of these things. So we walk in, and it's a room of 75 people that are coming in to talk about, how they are losing their house, basically. And we realized that what would happen is people would say, okay, you have your income, and they go through a bunch of stuff. And they'd find one, or they wouldn't find it, and then, 5 screens later, they'd say, oh, wait, I found my receipts. And so it became really apparent that you were going to be going back and forth between these 6 screens, and it was going to be a nightmare. And it was this great aha moment of, we have to consolidate this into a couple of screens so these people can jump around quickly. And that's kind of one of those things that you wouldn't get unless you actually saw this happening,
Right. So it's like I said, this might be, the scale might be unrealistic, for a lot of organizations because it takes so long if you don't have like a specific research team in place. But even just observing contextual use, even just, for a few minutes, for a few hours is super useful in terms of how usable you can make the system later on. Yeah.
Can you put up their resources, the 2 books that you were recommending?
Yep.
Do you find people get off task as they're showing you to say, well, I think it should do this, and start solutioning for you?
Definitely. I try to stay clear of that as much as I can. But if somebody is off talking about how a specific pain point they have, I just let them go. Like, there's a point where
Does that become a new bucket then of like things people think should happen?
Yeah, definitely. It's I found specifically with this CRM implementation process I'm working on, particularly one of the interviews I did, the woman I was speaking with just before I even introduced myself or anything, she just went, our process sucks, I hate doing all this, blah, blah, blah. Like, I had to reorganize a little bit. So it threw my internal protocol off for the system a bit, but it was really useful information because I could see kind of what she was doing and what she was struggling with, and I just kind of took it. I take, any data that you get is useful. It might just require some finagling on your end to bring it back around to observing the actual work process. Awesome. Okay, thank you guys.